Kia ora koutou. Welcome everyone to this online introduction on how to start your research into your family history. I'm Annette and I'm a family history librarian with Christchurch City Libraries. Now this session follows on from our first online class on forms and charts and will be the first in a series of 3 entitled Hatches, Matches and Dispatches. Today we'll cover how to start your search by learning how to find a birth. 2 more sessions on marriages and burials will be available soon. But today we'll be focusing on Christchurch and New Zealand resources, and we'll also show you some other lines of research that you can follow. Now these sessions will not be covering specialised whakapapa research. You can email library@ccc.govt.nz for help in this area. And we will also not be covering adoptions, as these are a very individual form of research. Before we start, here are a few points to remember. So, for a start, begin by talking to people, particularly older relatives, to find out what they know, and maybe think what they think they know. Family myths may not be strictly accurate, but they can sometimes provide a clue to follow up. So start with what you know: names of your parents, where they were born or grew up, names of grandparents, and approximate dates for when they were born, got married, died, where they lived, what their occupation was, and maybe even their religion. Now, if in your research you come across some information that may be helpful or can confirm a name, date or event, do note where you found it so that you can go back and find it again. It's also best to confirm your research findings in at least 2 places, preferably 3. Misspellings of names are common. Dates of life events may not be recorded accurately. Transcribed records can contain errors. So just because you found a person's name, it doesn't mean that's your ancestor. Many people may have the same name. So check and check again for that corroborating evidence. Now you may have found some information that fits, then further down the track you find something else that throws that first conclusion into doubt. You may have to go back and start again, which is why it's important to note where you've been with your research so you can track it again. And sometimes you just can't find an answer. Sometimes you just have to accept that and move on. But maybe later a new source will become available and you might get that answer after all. So lots of patience, dogged work, going around in circles but avoiding rabbit holes, and sometimes following that leap of intuition and thinking about what could have happened. But you need to find the evidence and confirm that it did happen. So why do we start with life events, i.e. births, deaths and marriages? It's really because these are probably the most reliable pieces of information that can help to pin down an ancestor's life, probably the closest you can get to the truth. We start by looking at records that come under a formal system of governance or control of information. So this means government records and church records, i.e. births, marriages and deaths, registered with the government. Also baptisms, marriages and funerals or burials carried out and registered by a church. Further into your research, you may need to look at school and employment records. Now you may be lucky enough to have some family records of your own, the old tradition of recording family events in the family Bible down through the generations, or someone may have done some research already on your family tree. But be very cautious of the information researched by others. It may have been uncovered sometime before a lot more information became available online. Mistakes such as confusing different generations and misidentifications can happen very easily, so I'd advise you to check for yourself. More and more newspapers are now being digitised on platforms such as Papers Past, and these can provide notices of births, engagements, marriages and deaths and funerals. So often additional names of family members can be picked up this way. And if you are able to find that birth in several different places, then you can be pretty certain of the basic facts and confirm that piece of your research. And now to find that birth. Remember the point about starting with the known? It's really helpful to be able to narrow down your search to a specific country if possible. And helpful if you know the city or town. If it's Christchurch, then Christchurch City Libraries has a lot of useful local resources. And we also have access to useful resources that have national coverage. Names and approximate times of arrival in New Zealand are useful. And remember that we think in terms of 20 years as a generation, very roughly, so can work backwards to get an estimate. So just keep asking yourself those questions. And remember that we're starting with the known, so we want to confirm that before we start working backwards. The Church Registers Index is unique to Christchurch City Libraries and is the result of a partnership between the library and the Canterbury branch of the New Zealand Society of Genealogists, now known as the Canterbury Genealogy Society. It's an alphabetical index of transcriptions on catalogue cards of records from the registers of churches around Christchurch and some surrounding areas. The transcriptions have been made by volunteers copying from the original registers. Now, these registers list the details of baptisms, marriages, and funerals or burials, the services carried out by the minister of the church. It's not comprehensive. If you can't find a name, it doesn't mean your ancestor wasn't born here in Christchurch, but you may need to check other sources. The entries are mostly Anglican, with some Methodist and Presbyterian, and a small number of Roman Catholic and other denominations. More information about the church registers is available on the Christchurch City Library's website. If you're lucky enough to strike gold, you may get some really useful information. What you get does depend on what was entered in the original record and can vary, but for a baptism you can hopefully get the full name of the infant, the date they were baptised, sometimes the date they were born, the names of the parents and sometimes the maiden name of the mother, where they lived, the occupation of the father, the name of the officiating minister, the church where the baptism took place, and the names of any sponsors or godparents to the child. Now note in this one the different spellings of Marjorie, and the church is St Peter's, Riccarton. What we don't see here is that little Ivor Cedric was also baptised in Wales when his mother took a trip over there 2 years earlier, but that's another story. For births that occurred outside of Christchurch, and those that did but aren't in the church registers, the best tool is the online database of New Zealand births, death and marriage, historical records, often referred to as NZBDM. You can use the website to search for historical birth, death and marriage records and order printouts or certificate copies of the relevant entries. Information available includes births that occurred at least 100 years ago, stillbirths that occurred at least 50 years ago, marriages and eventually civil unions that occurred 80 years ago, deaths that occurred at least 50 years ago, or the deceased date of birth was at least 80 years ago. But it's possible to glean quite a lot from the online information before you need to resort to a printout, for which there is a charge. So the example here is a search for Douglas Ackley. The mother's name is known in this instance, but a search can be made without it, or without the first name of the child. You must include a starting date and a pace to keep your search broad for a start, then narrow down. And the information we get from this search is the full name of the child, the mother and the father, and the year of registration, here 1920. Keep in mind that this is not necessarily the year of the birth. Registrations were sometimes made sometime after the birth. So now if we just search by the mother's name, something interesting happens. We get Douglas Hope Ackley and his full siblings, but we also get the children of the father's first marriage because her name included Mary. But because these are births which happened in New Zealand, we don't get the birth of Charles William Ackley's oldest child, who was born in England. This is where you can misidentify a family member if there's nothing coming up in your research to prompt a wider search. And we don't get the name NR, birth in 1902, where the mother is listed just as Gladys instead of Annie Gladys Mary, just the 1908 birth. NR stands for not recorded, which implies that the baby did not survive. But it looks like Charles William had a productive marriage with his second wife, Mary Marjorie. In this instance, I can confirm the twins, but it is possible to get siblings who were registered at the same time, so will have the same registration date, even if they are born in different years. This can be because the family was living in an isolated place with infrequent visits to town, or it can be because the children were born out of wedlock and perhaps the parents finally married and the children were registered all at the same time. And because the records are limited to those over 100 years ago, we don't get the birth of the youngest child. We'll find her soon, but again, you need to get that prompt to do that wider search. So it looks like we just get a year of registration, but we can get a little bit cunning here and narrow down the birth date using the search from and to date fields. So from a year to 6 months, to a month, to an exact date. And we find that Douglas Hope Ackley was born on the 8th of June 1920, which is a bit of a surprise because we always celebrated my dad's birthday on the 18th of June. So note that with NZBDM online, it requires exact spelling of names, so check for potential misspellings. Ackley with an EY also appears as Ackley with an LY. And be prepared to come back to search the database with a variation of the name. You may find it in a newspaper notice or other source. Sometimes you'll strike it lucky and the death record in NZBDM will give a date of birth rather than the number of years lived. And now we see that we were celebrating Dad's birthday on the right day. Interesting. But that may be because that was the date we gave to the funeral director at the time of his death. I need to go back and check that original birth certificate, and maybe I'll find that it was the 8th of June. Note here we see the death recorded for the 1902 baby born to Gladys and Charles William, and the time lived is given as 10 hours, and the death of another baby in 1908 who lived just 2 years. But these are all old records, over 100 years. So the Department of Internal Affairs has placed limits on when historical records can be made accessible by the general public, as shown before, so finding a birth that is more recent than 100 years ago can be challenging. So the first alternative is the New Zealand Births, Deaths and Marriages Index. This covers the years from 1849 to 1990. Note that other countries also place restrictions on open access to records to protect individual privacy and prevent identity fraud. So the information you can get does depend on the time period you're looking at, but it does also give you a reference number you can use to order a copy of the birth certificate or printout, for which there will be a charge. You'll get the name and the year, and for births and deaths from 1848 to 1955, you can use the district keys listing, which will help you narrow down the location of the birth and the year quarter. More recent years will give you the mother's name and place of birth. So this index is available on microfiche at Tuaranga, Christchurch City Libraries, but if you're not in Christchurch, check to see if your local library has it, or email us and we'll try and find the birth for you. And here you can see we have that missing Ackley daughter, born in 1931, so her birth record will not be available on NZBDM online until 2031. And note that there's no information about her parents available via this particular tool, but there is a reference number to quote when you request more information. The next resource is Papers Past. So this is a database of digitised historical newspapers from throughout New Zealand. Coverage varies from one province to another. At present, we're pretty lucky in Christchurch, we have digital access to the press up to 1979. So this gives those people living in or researching in Christchurch a big advantage, as it's much easier to search a newspaper online when you haven't got an exact date. So try searching on birth and the family name. And here's another Ackley example from 1949. However, whether you find a birth notice in a newspaper can be a bit random. No notice may be because of personal circumstances, including whether this was something the family could afford. Sometimes you'll find the firstborn child was the only one with a published birth notice. In this instance, it's actually a notice for the second-born child, possibly because the first was born not long after the Second World War and there were still paper shortages. The birth notices in Papers Past will sometimes give you an address, or at least a town or district. Here we have Ackley at Pururi Road, that's now street, so watch for street name changes, and we can go back to NZBDM online to confirm. Or for those who have access to Ancestry, you could try searching the New Zealand electoral rolls for the name of the father. Remember that after 1893, women could enrol to vote, so you may get the mother's name alongside the father's in the electoral roll. New Zealand electoral rolls are accessible on Ancestry up to 1981. Then for more recent years, try your local library. In Christchurch, only Tuaranga holds recent rolls for all electorates in New Zealand. If you belong to a library outside of the Christchurch network, try asking there for print or microfiche copies of electoral rolls or street directories. And remember that the listing is alphabetical by name, so you need to scan all the people with the name you're searching to see just who is living at a particular address. Street directories can be useful, but will list just one name for that address. And there can be a bit of a publication lag, so the information isn't necessarily current by the time the directory is published. Now, if you're working from home, you can try the Wilson collections. So Diane Wilson has spent over 40 years researching New Zealand records and indexes and has been supported by a massive army of volunteers. So, points to remember, this is a free collection to access. Some of the records that are indexed and searchable in the Wilson collection database include early settlers, burial and cremation records, World War I, electoral rolls, marriage records. So there's less useful for births, but here we have a cemetery record for Charles Ackley. However, if your ancestor wasn't born in New Zealand, how do you approach things? Access to overseas records has improved dramatically in the last 10 years with the growth of Ancestry and other similar databases. So check out your local library to see what databases you get access to via your library card, and look out for free trials. The Ancestry is getting a better coverage of New Zealand and Oceania material, and also records from non-English speaking European countries. Filtering by country before searching births can reduce the number of hits to trawl through. Then there's Find My Past, which has less US material but is strong on UK and Australian content, particularly passenger lists leaving the UK. Family Search has a partnership with Archives New Zealand, and they are loading a lot of their digitised records onto Family Search, their wills and probates, passenger lists. So it's really good for New Zealand material, but also useful for overseas records, and it's free. MyHeritage, unlike Ancestry and Family Search, Christchurch City Libraries can access from home by going through the Christchurch City Libraries portal. If you have Scottish heritage, Scotland's People is extremely helpful and free to use for those preliminary searches, though you have to pay for copies of any records, including those original records, which sometimes can be a lot more helpful than the transcripts. Irish genealogy, well, some official records were lost in 1922 when a bombardment and fire destroyed the Public Records Office, and that included wills and records from some census years. But more material is becoming available online, for example, parish records, and they have recently launched Beyond 22, which is Ireland's virtual record treasury. It helps if you know which country they came from. So searching for national archives and records for a specific country can throw up some useful websites. Remember to search for state or county records as well as the national, i.e. central government ones. Church records are really useful, and for births can often give more information than the government registers. Family history enthusiasts are generating a lot of databases that provide access to records such as passenger lists, but be careful to confirm the source of the information. An organisation, as opposed to an individual, may have slightly more robust research capacity and processes. So looking here at the United Kingdom, you can see that there are a lot of free websites with material that may help your research. But if you come up against a brick wall in trying to track a birth, maybe you need to use a bit of lateral thinking and approach the problem from a different angle. Military records will hopefully give a date of birth, but do remember that the year of birth may not be accurate if they were trying to enlist under age. Also, next of kin might be there, mother, father, sibling, and a place of residence and previous employment. Immigration records will vary a lot, but there's a good chance you'll get the country, the place of birth or embarkation, occupation and age, from which you can then work out an approximate birth year. It's interesting to see that there's more recent immigration information becoming available. Naturalisation records will depend on the country. Note that in this example, the arrival year in the US is wrong. It should be 1923, which I confirmed with a passenger list, but it does give us a date and a place of birth. And this particular discovery sparked a whole new line to follow in the US, which I hadn't even considered before. And if you're lucky, you may find a date of birth inscribed on your ancestor's gravestone, or at least a year of birth or years lived. So just a reminder to explore some of the New Zealand websites for hints on research and access to records. I haven't actually used Archives New Zealand's new collections search in this session, but it's useful for those other life events, and sometimes children's names are listed in a will. And don't forget to check out the additional information on those overseas sites as well. You can save yourself potential frustration by checking the date range and scope of the database first, so you know exactly what you're looking for. So that's it. If you need more help and you're a Christchurch local, come and visit us on the Tuakiri Identity floor of Turanga, that's up on the second floor, or drop into your local library to see what they have on offer. And keep an eye on the Christchurch City Library's website for more family history related sessions. And you can always email us if you need some help. So tēnā koutou, katoa, and thank you everybody.